some of the things I've seen guys do, the selflessness with which they act, their willingness to get up and move through a wall of steel if you're a medic to help somebody who just got shot. That is an astounding level of courage.
Welcome to Mindset Lessons from the Field. I'm Gina Casazza, the author of the upcoming memoir, Training with the SEAL. Today's guest I met on Substack, where he writes original essays exploring why we live and how we live through the extremes of human experiences. He is a former Navy SEAL. He is the co-founder of Zero Eyes, where they use human-verified AI gun detection solution that integrates into existing digital security cameras with a mission to end mass shootings in America. He is also the co-host of the podcast, The Nobel, where he is joined by special operations veterans, entrepreneurs, investors, and others to optimize your technology, life, and mind. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really excited to introduce you guys today to Sam Alaimo. Sam, thank you so much for being on the show.
It's a pleasure. I appreciate you having me.
I'm really excited. I really got into your Substack and had to have you on because they're so unique. They're very insightful. You come up with this it's philosophical, this stoicism. I like how you incorporate your life and your military and the military in general into human experience, right? And you're all about hardships and resilience, and there's a mindset show. So I had to have you on. So this is going to be a little different for the listeners right now. It's not going to be the standard, tell me about why you went to be a SEAL. I'm sure that's fascinating. However, your Substack is way more fascinating, I feel, because it's unique. And I really want to, again, dive into it. So I'm going to just get started with asking you some questions based off of your brilliant writing. And let's start with the self-care post, because that was the most recent one. And I feel like after this, when listeners go, that's going to be maybe the first one that they see, or maybe not. But I really enjoyed it because, you talked about ending self-care and embracing hardship. And, you argued that self-care is a symptom of the existential, the woe of existence right now, as opposed to a solution, right? And I want to know why you think people today feel the need for self-care, right? Whereas in the past, maybe they didn't feel that need. And what have we lost that makes us naturally stronger? And how do we get that back?
Yeah, it's a big question. In that piece, I was kind of taking an idea and trying to approach it with sniper shots from a couple of different angles. And when you look at the concept of self-care, there's some good stuff out there, like, hey, get outside, be physical. There's a lot of bad stuff out there. Go binge, buy as many things as humanly possible. Give in to whatever your particular problem is and try to bury it by acquiring more things or worrying about how you look or how many likes you got on a post. When we should be asking, why do we need the concept of self-care in the first place? What is so wrong that people say, I need self-care, I need to buy things? And I think when you kind of open up the hood and look inside, a lot of the existentialist philosophers would write about sort of the lack of usefulness we feel on a day-to-day basis. And this caustic sense of anxiety people feel at all times. And anxiety is different from fear. Fear is, I'm afraid of this tangible thing in my immediate future. Anxiety is this general sense of unease and not really knowing why. And that is something very strange, because when you look at the pre-state world, prior to agriculture, for example, or even just a few hundred years ago, people got on just fine without having to buy anything to be happy. They didn't need to get the latest gadget. They didn't need to get the latest sweatpants. They didn't have to rewatch movies. They didn't need a television, and they were fine. Their struggles were very different. And I'm trying to argue in that piece that what's happening in the modern day is we're in an environment we were not evolved for, that the natural state, the examples I gave were ancestral men and women on a daily basis having to walk 5 or plus more miles a day with heavy weight on their back. So they're outside, they have sun on their skin, they're breathing, they're social, they're with each other, they're doing some life-sustaining task. And because of that, there was no such thing as self-care. You can counter that in a million different ways. But they were at risk of being eaten by a wolf while they were out there. They were at risk of being targeted by an enemy assassin, an enemy warrior, a warring neighboring tribe. But that is the sort of hardship that we evolved with. It's the hardship we lived millions of years with. And it seems to be we encounter that sort of hardship, the hardship of being outside, carrying weight, having to deal with threats in a far more noble manner than we do the hardship of the anxiety. I look at it from the perspective of the immune system. We have an immune system that once you have some sort of pathogen in your body, the immune system fights it off. We have a behavioral immune system, which means that when we have some potential pathogen outside the body, like moldy meat or moldy milk, our body warns us, don't eat it, you're going to get sick. But we don't have a hardship immune system, which says, hey, in the absence of hardship, be careful. Be careful you walk so little that you develop metabolic disease. Be careful that you have so little absolute crucial things you have to do throughout the day that keep you alive, that you're going to end up being corrupted by a sense of anxiety or uselessness or meaninglessness. So I approach it from a lot of different angles. Hopefully that adds some color to it.
You mentioned the ancestral hardships, right? How can we incorporate, like intentionally integrate ancestral hardships into like the modern world? And how would you explain the ancestral hardships versus the modern hardships?
Yeah, ancestral hardship would be having to utilize your body in a pretty rugged way every single day. Ancestral hardship would be living with constant knowledge that your band could be attacked by some form of predatory animal or predatory neighbors. And all these different hardships back in the day, including, let's say, famine or drought, required you to constantly be oriented to the outside world as opposed to the inside world, and required you to have a super tight band. You had to be extremely tight-knit, integrated with your kith and kin. So I think that's completely countered by the modern hardship, which is the absence of all of those things. It's the ability to literally drift. And that's then compounded by the addition of, let's say, technology, of social media, of endless things that can be bought. So going back to the ancestral hardship, what I'm trying to articulate in these essays, and it's building up over time, is that we can merge the best of the ancestral world with the modern. There's no going back to the hunter-gatherer days. That dream is done. Nor do I think we want to. I think most people, when they get a tooth pulled or open heart surgery, are glad that they don't feel it because they have anesthesia. Or when they're sick, they get to take antibiotics. I love hot showers, for instance. So like, there's a lot of good things we want to keep, but we can integrate bearing heavy loads for time, rucking. We can remember that the world isn't perfectly safe, that wars are always ongoing, that war and violence, the exact opposite of peace, was the normal for most of human condition. And when we admit that, that's something to train for. It's something to prepare against. And instead of assuming that peace is going to last for 10,000 years, which it never has, think about what that means for yourself and for your family. Prepare for it. That gives you something to kind of have it as an antagonist, something to build up your defenses against, not only your physicality, not only your mental toughness, but making sure your house is in some way fortified. You have enough food and water for a certain period of time. And what this does is it gives you a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, instead of just drifting, waiting for the next fight to come around. Because I sincerely believe we're built for a fight. And if we don't have a good fight, we turn on ourselves.
You know, you talk about suffering and stuff and hardship and all that. From SEAL training, war zones, like what did you personally learn about suffering that we're not going to experience, but like that you learned and that people should be experiencing, like in everyday life? Is there something that you learned that we should be learning in everyday life from suffering?
Oh, there's so much. There's so much I didn't know until I went in and did it. You know, I went in when I was 19 to become a SEAL. My eyes were opened in a lot of different ways. The ancient Stoics would talk a lot about death. They would reframe almost everything from the perspective of death. One of the aspects of the SEAL teams that really struck me was I had a typical lower income childhood. Like I wasn't surrounded by war. Getting into that training was, in a way you think about it, it was everyday training not to die and to wage war against an enemy. Death was like a fully integrated part of it. And it's a culture of positive fatalism. So it's almost the inverse of what the Stoics would do. The Stoics would have you prepare for death. Think about death. Don't be stunned by it. Don't be afraid of it. Meditate on it. Write about it. Think about it every day. It's the inverse of what the military does. You don't train to die when you train for war. You train to live. You train to live as aggressively as humanly possible to make the enemy die. It's kind of got the best of both worlds, because in that circumstance, you do have to think about your own death, but you also then learn the full meaning of life by knowing its opposite. The more you're surrounded by the death of the enemy or the death of your brothers, the more the value of life becomes known and the more you want to fight for it. There's this healthy circle. And I kind of realized this is what it must have been like in the ancestral world. They were constantly at threat of losing their lives and the lives of those they love. And that constant reframing puts everything else in perspective. If I happen to be cold, or if my teepee happens to burn down, or I suddenly lost a store of food for the winter, at the end of the day, I'm still alive. I still have the chance to fight and get after it. Whereas today, the opportunity to get upset about some of the most minor things imaginable, it plagues us all. It plagues me. I'll get upset on a daily basis about something completely irrelevant. And then once I remember, hey, I'm still breathing, all of a sudden it's not a big deal. It's like one of the best things I got from the SEAL teams was this perspective on life and death. Yeah, there's a million more besides.
It's funny you say that because I think about death all the time, where but it helps me to live. Like, I remember, well, just think Christmas, right? My family, we're all together, and I'm like, in my mind, I'm going, this could be our last Christmas together. We never know, right? We never know. And it makes me grateful for the moment. And I take it in, like, when I'm like, this could be our last Christmas, like, and you mentioned this in one of your pieces. You talked about like how in war it like amplifies like life, where like like I think you mentioned something about like taste of watermelon or something, like how like you really can like you really like savored the taste, right? And you like understand the moment. And that's what I do a lot of times when I am, in a moment that I'm really loving or with my family. And even if they're driving me nuts, because that's what family does, I am just sitting back though and going like, there's going to be a day they can't drive me nuts, or one of us aren't going to drive each other nuts. And I actually just texted my brothers 2 days ago because I call them every day, and they're boys. They're just like, we don't need to talk every day. Like, it's not like there's nothing new from yesterday to today. And I messaged them and I was like, listen, it's because there's going to be one day where you are not going to pick up the phone, or I'm not going to be able to pick up the phone. And when that day comes, I want to look back and go, we were close and we talked every day. And like, it means something. So you also talked about like the delusion of immortality. We feel like we have endless time, right? And how does facing death change your relationship with time, and what can we learn from that?
Yeah, you raise a lot of good points in there. Heavy into the Stoicism for a while, particularly Epictetus, and every other word out of his mouth was death. And it was so much that it was so much thinking about death that it was detrimental to me personally, that I needed to go back to that combat mode of mind that, hey, training for death is one thing, but training for life is an entirely separate thing. And the color I viewed the world changed radically between thinking on death every day. It almost became like morose, like it was constantly a downer. But then countering that with, hey, death from a certain perspective, focus on life. And the piece you're talking about was a memory I had with a watermelon. When you're in that like positive fatalism mentality, when you know that each day might be your last, the next mission might be your last, like food takes on an entirely different perspective. And that's just one aspect. It impacts all life, but like that's a good one for people to focus on. And I ate a watermelon one night after having eaten MREs for months before that. And it was the best tasting thing in the world because I was doing nothing but eating that watermelon. And it was fresh. I wasn't watching television while I was eating it. I wasn't thinking about anything else while I was eating it. It was just complete zone in the second. And when you know that like death could be around the corner, like it was in war, like it was in the ancestral time, the most important aspect of time is no longer the future. It's the present moment, because the future is completely uncertain. The future is always an if. So instead of saying, I'm gonna just sacrifice everything for some future goal, it's I'm going to put my complete attention and time and focus on this present second, this moment. And that's what you're talking about, calling your brother, taking advantage of today, because today you're here right now. You have the opportunity. Tomorrow, maybe you won't. And I think that integrating that sort of practice into daily life, what it used to be like back in the day, what it currently is still in war, what I think would allow us all to slow down a little bit, stop obsessing about that long-term goal that's a year out or 10 years out, and reframe it so that it's not just about the end goal. It's also about the process, because life at the end of the day is nothing but a process. There is no arrival. That's a good lesson learned.
It's funny that you say that because the very, very first episode, we had the Navy SEAL that trained me, John McLaren, and he said, if the goal was to become a Navy SEAL, he goes, then when they took the photo of everyone that made it through, he goes, that would have been it. He goes, and that was it. He goes, but it's it's a whole journey, not like this destination, because if we would have got to that photo and that would have been it, it's just like it wasn't, it was just like, oh, this is it. Like, this is, and you have to like accumulate everything, the whole entire journey that you're at to really appreciate, like, not that one pit stop, that's like, that was like one pit stop. And then, you go into the SEAL teams and then you go here and and you move up and stuff like that. And he goes, it's like these constant destinations until the very, very end of your life, or the constant pit stops until the very end of the whole entire thing. And I feel like a lot of people in life, especially for myself now, I'm noticing it with being around more retirees, and they're like about to retire and they're like, now I'm finally going to be able to travel and all this stuff. And it's like, and people are like, I need to start getting in shape so I can, walk around Italy and stuff like that. It's like, you should have been doing that 30 years ago. And why now? I read this book, Die with Zero by Bill Perkins, and I'm taking it very literally these days, or every single time something comes in, I'm like, oh, excellent. Now I could publish this book of mine that I've been thinking, oh, excellent. Now I could go swim with the orcas. Like, I'm always like, and everyone's like, don't you want to save it? And I'm like, it's not coming with me in the afterlife. I don't want to be the richest person in the cemetery. Like, that's how I'm looking at things. And I want to know, like, and it allows me, though, to be grateful for living. Like you mentioned, like fighting for life. I think life is absolutely beautiful, and we get so lost in the fear, right? Because we're in a fear-mongering society these days where, and then we get and then the littlest thing, like you mentioned, like the littlest thing can annoy us and set us off, and then it spirals us down when we don't catch it, right? Into real darkness where we're just like annoyed and don't want to live anymore, right? And I just find it so interesting, because when you could just be grateful for sunshine or rain, anything, it changes your perspective again to give you something to fight for. And I want to know, like, how can we, through your perspective, train ourselves to experience gratitude like that without needing it to be a life or death situation?
Yeah, that's tough. One way in the article we were talking about is through synesthesia, which is kind of mixing up senses. And it's almost a test. If you're eating some sort of food, if you're eating a grape, can you challenge yourself to figure out what is the sound of that taste? Like, pay such granular attention to the taste of the grape that what sound does it remind you of? Does it remind you of the sound of a guitar or of wind in the leaves? And it's a method of like such intense focus that it almost becomes an art form. Eating is itself an art form. Don't have to listen to a podcast while you're doing it. You brought up a good point about the SEAL referencing his graduation. I've found something similar. There's times when you'll sacrifice for a goal, whether it's people who get a college degree, or they finally get the job they want, or they study really hard for a test that they finally passed. And a lot of times when you finally get it, it's like, so this is it. This was what I spent so much time training for. And it raises the question, it was worth less than what I put into it, if that makes sense. It was actually the process that should have itself been the enjoyable aspect of attaining that goal. The goal is just a cherry. But oftentimes what comes after that is like, shit, well, what now? Like, what do I do now? What other thing can I sink my teeth into and obsess about and make my life about? It kind of got off the topic of gratitude, but I think gratitude is sort of a culmination of everything we talked about. It's being in the moment, reframing everything from the fact that it's not going to last forever. The things we're working towards in the future may or may not come, and that's almost irrelevant. What matters is the meaning we find in this particular second in time. That's something Viktor Frankl wrote about in Man's Search for Meaning, and he's a man who knew it. He was in the concentration camps. He was in Auschwitz. He knew that even in the worst case situation, if you were in Auschwitz and your death was the next day, there was still meaning to be found in the moment, no matter how bad it can get, even just by seeing how well you can handle that moment. So there's gratitude to be found in any circumstance. And there's a lot of really wise people out there like Frankl who can teach us how to do it.
One of my favorite articles actually that you've written, or essays, was the combat diving one and mindfulness. And as you're talking about, the grape and the sound and, and really being mindful and in the moment, it brought me to that combat diving essay that you wrote. I really recommend that one all of yours are great. That one I just really enjoyed because it's something that you talked about there's something, and many people have been on the show talking about like, there's just something about like being so close to death because your oxygen and breath and everything like that is cut off, that you have to stay calm and mindful when, you want to panic and that's where death is going to happen. Right. So how, how did you, or, and what do you have for our listeners in terms of like developing control over, every moment, every thought, and being mindful, especially in those panic situations? And how can we, I guess, apply that level of awareness to our daily lives?
I haven't thought about that piece in a while. Combat diving sucks in a lot of ways. If you're in an already pitch black water bay in the middle of the night and you have a rebreather, which means it doesn't produce bubbles, and you're 15 feet underwater, it is so black you can't see your hand in front of your face, and all you have is a little compass with a tiny glow stick in it, so you can see the direction, and a watch to keep track of how long you've been there. And beforehand, you memorize your route, so what bearing you're going to hold for how many kicks, and then you're going to hit some obstacle, maybe a pier, maybe a certain ship, and then you're going to use that to reframe and reorient, and then you're going to zigzag to your target, which is a ship that you have to put a bomb on. It becomes very clear what is within your control and what is not within your control. And I think that's probably the best way to train it, because that doesn't just apply there. The combat diving just makes it crystal clear that at this moment in time, I cannot control what the enemy is doing on that ship that I'm underwater with, where if they drop a grenade in the water, we're all dead. Where if a single bubble gets out of my wetsuit or my mask and goes up there, they might become suspicious that someone's beneath their ship and do something about it. What is within your control is remaining completely calm and making sure you know the right bearing, making sure you're beneath the right ship, making sure you're setting the fuse correctly, making sure your buddy's still there with you. And then everything else you just let go. You have no choice but to let it go or completely lose your mind. But I think outside of that situation, I still find myself doing it now. We have the delusion that almost everything is within our control. We can turn a thermostat up or down, and all of a sudden we control the temperature. We can control the hours of our day for work or whatever personal endeavor we happen to have. In reality, almost none of that's under our control, because it can change in a fraction of a second. But I guess one extreme example would be the lockdown for COVID. Nobody knew that was going to happen. That was completely outside of our control. And that might even be a warm-up for something worse that can come in the future. It's always good to remember what is within our control, and that's remaining calm, despite how horrible everything else is going around us. And remembering that we can remain calm, we can prepare for it ahead of time. But at the end of the day, circumstances are going to be circumstances. And the one muscle we have absolute command over is the mind. And training that thing is itself, I think, a worthy endeavor.
This podcast episode is brought to you by Thrivers Coffee. Podcast guest Nick McKinley's company, Deliver Fund, brings you guys Thrivers Coffee. It is ethically sourced, it's organic, and it supports traffic survivors. That is right. Thrivers Coffee is all about empowering us to making a difference in the fight to end human trafficking. That's why 100% of the proceeds go directly towards their goal of bringing freedom to victims of human trafficking. So if you guys love coffee that is organic, ethically sourced, and tastes absolutely delicious, and want to help to end the fight of human trafficking, check out Nick McKinley's company, Thrivers Coffee. If someone was to come to you and say, well, how do you train the mind? What would you be saying? Or what should I be doing to train my mind to stay calm in those? Because I could just tell you right off the bat, like, first of all, water's a huge fear of mine, even though I really enjoy it. And I go in it just because I sometimes like to, test how scared I am at things. And, all I'd be thinking about, I can't see in front of me, I'm in the water. And then in my mind, I have this crazy imagination that just, I mean, the most unrealistic thing I still think about whenever I jump into a pool and I just land there, I just feel like a shark is right in front of me. And I see it in my mind, even though it's not real. And that's not true. There's no shark in the pool. So, it's the same thing with the ocean. I mean, I was so terrified of this really ridiculous fear that I went cageless shark diving just to be like, Gina, they're fine. It's all your imagination. But I mean, I put myself through the most ridiculous things to just prove to myself that like it's your own imagination in fear, right? But I know that a normal human being would not be doing things like that, right? Like when I went to go to SEER, I did civilian SEER, not your SEER. And I said to Coach Mac, I was like, what about the snakes? I'm going to be like hiding in the woods. And what if like a snake comes out? I'm terrified. And he's like, that's the last thing that's going to be on your mind is a snake. And I'm like, this is the first thing on my mind right now. And I then started taking myself to Petco to hold the snakes and to just be like, and every time the first time I did it, I started crying and the person was like wondering what was wrong with me because I went in there asking like, I was like, oh, I'm curious about having a snake for a pet, which was a lie. And then when I went to go and hold it, I'm just like, they're just so beautiful. I was trying to like make them think I wasn't so terrified, but I would do that until finally I was able to reach in and hold it myself, But like, what would you have in terms of like teaching yourself to remain calm, to be in the calm, to develop that mindset of being calm, especially in times of complete fear?
I think it's a gradual process. And I think the root of it is deliberately implementing certain forms of hardship. And that's the theme I constantly get around. How do we integrate the beneficial aspects of the ancient world with like the wonderful luxuries of the modern? And it goes back to replicating certain things our ancestors would do. One of the best ways is like zone 5 interval training, extremely high heart rate. Get up there, feel the burn in your muscles, get close to panic breathing, and nonetheless stay calm. Keep your face relaxed, keep command of your breath, be mindful of your thoughts. And at some point, something has to give. Either you're going to break and quit, or you're going to overcome it and learn a sense of command. Same thing with heat exposure. Sauna is all the rage nowadays for a good reason. I got a barrel sauna. And when you're in there for 20 minutes at 210 degrees, all life becomes reduced down to command your breath. That's it. Your thoughts go away. Your worries go away. It's, can I breathe calmly despite my body completely trying to panic at the moment? Same thing with the inverse, extreme cold exposure. Cold plunges are popular for a reason. It makes you feel good also. But at the same time, it challenges you mentally. Can you get in the water in the first place? Can you then stay in there? And then once you're in there, can you remain calm? Can you almost take a third party observer and see yourself sitting in there and see yourself doing it masterfully as opposed to your teeth chattering and panic breathing and just trying to get out? Can you learn to enjoy it? I think that's probably one of the best ways. Hard breathing, heat, cold, any sort of particular challenge that gets us out of like the normal day-to-day static baseline existence, I think is an opportunity to train that exact trait.
As a SEAL, you expect, and then in war, you're going to face like extreme adversity, right? And, and then, you transition into the civilian world, not as extreme, but, then you're in business and other stuff. Do you have a story where, like you might have come close to a breaking point? And if so, how did you push through it?
Probably the worst challenge I had was the transition out of the military. I've tried to look at it from a couple of different angles. I always look at it from a pre-state perspective. Like how did humans live? How does that compare to my experience? My experience was growing up, typical American upbringing. And that means not immersed in war, not immersed in extreme hardship, not immersed in hunger. America is a pretty great place to be. And then what the military and the SEAL teams did was prepare you for the absolute worst it could be. You're training for war. You're training to keep your friends and your brothers and your teammates from dying. You're training to kill. So they're basically reconditioning you back to what an ancient human would be. You go to war, you execute those skill sets, that becomes the new you. Your brain forms in that environment. And then all of a sudden, in a fraction of a second, you're no longer in that environment. You go back to the civilian world. So I was 30 days after a 9-month tour to the tribal lands of Afghanistan. I was sitting in a classroom in Manhattan at Columbia University. And that was enough to almost break my mind, like completely break my grip on reality. It was such a massive pivot. And there was no preparation. There was no deconditioning from that environment to what it's like to be in the most safe and privileged and wealthy and provided for existence on the face of the planet. That was extraordinarily difficult. That was the most difficult thing I ever did. And getting through it, I mean, there was a iterative process. It took me years. One of the strongest things I did was literally the hard training. Like the hard physical training kept me grounded, kept my mind on the world around me, kept my mind on breathing and command, as opposed to all the myriad things I was trying to deal with. And then that wasn't enough. A lot of buddies would get into things like base jumping. So basically jumping off the side of a cliff or a building. It's only one parachute, it's only one shot. Too many people die. Too many buddies have died doing it. And I think they're trying to get closer to what it feels like to be on a mission, to be in a firefight. And to me, that kind of sport, it would get you close, but it would never get you close enough. It would never be the same thrill. It would never be the same joy in the hunt. And to me, that made it almost foreign, like I was trying to cheat it. So I went the complete opposite direction. I went to philosophy. I started reading all the great books that I never took the time to read earlier in my life. Got really into Aristotle, really into Plato, and that introduced me to characters like Socrates. And I didn't even know it at the time, but he was a combat veteran. He fought in at least 3 campaigns against the Spartans in the Peloponnesian War. And all I had known from him was he was this overweight, older philosopher who was executed for wanting to get down to the truth of the matter, for pissing some people off. And it made me wonder, why is nobody talking about the fact that his entire philosophy may have been shaped from his combat experience? Maybe what he saw in combat was what made him so diabolically focused on ridding the world of ignorance. Because to him, maybe we got into war because of ignorance. Maybe that's why he pestered so many people that they literally murdered him, that the state literally murdered him. That opened up this whole world of, I don't think philosophy, especially academic philosophy, is true philosophy. If you look at it from the founder of philosophy, which is, you could argue, Socrates, the founder of ethical philosophy. And that just opened up this entire world that I could obsess about and I could get into and could open up insights into the human soul, starting off with my own, because I had a lot of shit I had to figure out. And so I guess 2 ways would be that physical hardship component, getting back to that rigorous demand of the body, but then also really stimulating the mind and figuring out, who are you? Why do you think the way you do? Why do the things that bother you maybe not bother other people? What does it signify? And that itself is a worthwhile journey and effort. So that's one answer to your question.
No, that was a really great answer. I really appreciate that. I had to ask because I really wanted to know, like, in terms of, the adversities that you face and like what you personally go through, because I feel like I feel like we all experience adversity differently and how you get through. And I do feel like we're all going to get through it. Like you all get through adversity. It's just how you get through it. Are you going to get through it, enjoying it and, seeing the positives and all that other stuff? Or are you going to get through it, panicking and miserable and all upset? And then when you get out the other side, it's like, it's 2 different ways to look at it, and really being able to train yourself to look at it differently than I'm going to panic and not enjoy everything, because hardships are going to come no matter whether you like it or not. So you might as well just, learn to smile through the pain, right? How do we train ourselves like to constantly assess like what's the condition of my thoughts, so that way we're able to get in the mindset of not be so on that downward spiral and in that anxiety and all that stuff. So how do you train yourself to constantly, assess and go, what is the condition of my thoughts right now?
In the SEAL teams, when you're on a patrol, you have 3 questions you're taught to ask again and again and again. What's the condition of my weapon? What would I do if I were contacted right now? And how can I best support my buddy? And it was meant to keep your mind primed at every second of an ambush to be 10 steps ahead of an enemy. So as you're walking, you're already thinking, if I were a bad guy, I would want to ambush us from that hilltop right there. And if a firefight kicked off right now, is my weapon locked and loaded? Do I have a bullet in the chamber ready to rock and roll? Is my weapon on safe? Am I ready to put it on fire? All the basic stuff. And those questions on repeat kept you completely dynamic and engaged in the moment. And I think it's possible to retool those questions to a civilian environment. What is my mind doing right now? What sensation am I feeling? What is my emotion right now? And is it grounded? Is it based on something, some conflict in my mind? Or is it based on something in my environment? If so, what is that? I think at the end of the day, it's just a stimulated mind. It's teaching yourself to be extremely curious about the world and about the functioning of your own mind. And when you do it enough, it becomes automatic. It becomes a game. It becomes like a thrill in and of itself, just like it was on a patrol asking those three questions. I think at the end of the day, it's habitualizing that active, curious, probing mindset, and which just comes down to kind of a joy of living. Like, do you enjoy being here? And if you do, think about it, like contemplate it, constantly be on your toes.
One thing that you mentioned, I remember as you're talking about this, you mentioned about like ease is a disease, where we live in a world that's designed to be easier, right? Like you mentioned, you can just turn up the thermostat for cold or hot, whatever, and life is easier, right? You don't want to go outside, you're feeling sick, you could get somebody to bring you soup and, order you food or something like that. Like, how do we resist the pull towards weakness? Like in terms of like, yes, it's great in so many great ways. Like you said, I don't think people want to go back to the hunter gatherer days, where you're living in a teepee or a hut, as opposed to right now having a roof over your head and and being able to control the temperature in your house and stuff like that. But how do we resist it to where it becomes complete overboard, where we are weaker?
I think one of the most powerful ways would be deliberate discomfort. When I say ease is a disease, I look at it from the perspective, like we talked about before, from the immune system perspective. It's a disease for which we have no defense against. We can be infected with disease thinking it's the best thing in the world because we never had the option throughout ancestral time to eat ourselves into weighing 300 pounds. We never had the option to eat ourselves until a large percentage of the population had to be on some sort of weight loss drug or getting liposuction or something ridiculous like that. And we never had the option of just laying around for so long that it ended up in these psychological disturbances people have, incredible rates of depression or anxiety, and then needing medication to solve that. That didn't exist for millions of years, and suddenly it does. I think that deliberate discomfort would reframe everything. Going back to the thermostat example, I don't think anybody really knows what it is to feel comfortably warm until they know what extremely uncomfortable cold is. Like, that's the simplest example in the world. When we have the nice things, when we have the absence of violence, when we have the absence of cold, the absence of heat, the absence of hunger, it's so incredibly easy to take it for granted. That becomes like the new baseline. You don't really think that, God, this is great, until the second all of that is threatened and you're suddenly extremely hungry because you just decided to do a 3-day water fast. Like, what a great way to make yourself grateful for having food, and not even junk food, not even the most excess stuff, but just an apple or a handful of raspberries after 3 days of not eating is the best thing in the world. It beats any cheesecake. Same thing with cold. Like, a warm shower is great, but it doesn't mean shit unless we know what it is to be in 32-degree water. So there's a lot of ways to train that. And I think it's through this deliberate implementation of hardship. I'm not saying we have to go live in Siberia. I'm just saying, like, a few minutes a day of a little bit of hardship can reframe everything about life.
It's funny because growing up, I think we were like the only family in my town that did not have central air or any form of air.
Right.
And it's not that we couldn't at all. Like my dad was just like, because I grew up on Long Island, and he was like, it's 3 months out of the year. I'm not going to, he's like, it's not that he couldn't do it. He chose not to. He's like, I choose not to spend 20 grand to put ACE to give you guys central air and be comfortable when you could just 3 months out of the year. And I'm like, I'm so hot. He goes, go take a cold shower, jump in the pool. He's like, there's other things that you could do. And like nobody wanted to sleep over my house in the summer because of that reason. But it was just funny though, because then when I left and I had my own place and I had air conditioning, it was just like, whoa, like this is what life is like with being able to have breathed properly. But at the same time, you really appreciated it because, you develop this bit of resilience. And anytime I'm really, really hot outside, I always think back to my days of like sleeping in like 90 in a sauna, technically. But, it does. And sometimes for myself, I know like that was an uncomfortability, not by choice. It was just the moment. But for myself, when I find myself very comfortable, I'm always like, okay, what can I do? I'm getting too comfortable in life. I need to go do something uncomfortable. Like whether it's go sleep outside or, go for a 12-mile walk or do something that's, out of my comfort zone because I don't want to be so complacent. And I think we had Navy SEAL Don Mann on the show. He's in the second episode and he talked about how most people get up, go to work, eat, go to sleep, and that's it. And that's their existence. And we've just been so complacent for that instead of, going to live life and experience it and see those beauties and those moments. So for someone that's listening that like wants that's like, oh my God, that's me right now. And I really want to develop my mental fitness and, and they're not training for war, but extreme conditions aside from like, like I know you mentioned like the hot, the cold and stuff like that. Like what are some other ways and best ways that they could like ease into starting to develop that mental fitness?
And it's tough outside of the physical realm that I was talking about. I'm not really sure. I've always looked at it in the sense of use your body, challenge your body, which then challenges your mind and allows you the chance to kind of rewire how your mind functions. I guess if you look at it from the perspective of the mind without the body, maybe there's a certain mindfulness practice that could work, a meditation practice, maybe just focusing on your breath. The box breathing is a classic one. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4. And all these things kind of pull you out of whatever is kind of in your head and pulling you away from the present moment and ground you again here in reality. I'm not sure how else to answer that question.
You know what I want to ask, which kind of it sparked from what you just said. Was there something in combat that taught you about like human nature that like most people don't realize or haven't realized?
Human nature in combat. I think there's a lot there. Combat, it lays bare what you are, depending on how intense the combat is. You very quickly learn what you are, how strongly you believe in it, what was your motive for getting in that position in the first place. Do you instantly regret it? Or when the bullets are coming, do you say, yeah, I'm here for the right reason? It makes you realize that training is one thing, reality is another. Are you going to focus on the intensity of the moment and the fear of death and the fear of a bullet getting through your body? Or are you going to take all that and just put it aside and do the thing for which you train for? And when it comes down to the human nature, it reveals how much ability we have to command ourselves in the worst case situation up until the moment of death, but also how quickly we can sabotage ourselves and fail that circumstance. And, it's a humbling experience for everybody who does it. There are some superhumans who get in there and it's just perfection. But I think they're the few. Most people get in that situation and have a lot to think about after the first time. It's just a window into human nature. I'm not sure if it's universal truth, but it lays bare what you are and it gives you the chance to see everybody around you. What are they? And some of the things I've seen guys do, the selflessness with which they act, their willingness to get up and move through a wall of steel, if you're a medic, to help somebody who just got shot. That is an astounding level of courage. And it reveals, as horrible as war is, you're killing other people. It also reveals just how awesome the human condition can be, just how much people can give a damn, willing to risk their lives to save somebody else's. So there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, that books can be written on that subject, but it's a great window into the soul.
What'd you learn about yourself?
I think it goes back to our command discussion. The natural reaction for a human in that situation is to try to get out of the situation. All the training in the world, as a SEAL, you spend at least 3 years training just for that first moment. And even still, it's such a hardcore experience. You have to take deliberate command. You can't just sit back and rely on your training. I learned how effective that training was. I learned what it is to have that complete black and white binary, that 1 or 0. Either I do this thing or I don't do it. And if I don't do it, you're going to regret that the rest of your life. If you do it, you're overcoming and breaking that, I guess, that last barrier. Training only gets you so far, but actually overcoming the voices inside of your skull and executing a mission, despite how horrible it could be. That I learned that switch, that binary. After that, everything becomes a simple binary. Either I do it or I don't. And at the end of the day, it's my choice. It's completely up to us at every moment in time. There's no victim. There's no victim left after that. You either do it or you don't.
At what point in your life did you learn the my choices, my, like the it's my life, the victim, the victor, not the victim?
I learned it early on in childhood. I think that maybe that's not common. Like the situation I grew up in, it became, I just always had an attunement to the fact that, like, no matter what circumstance you're born in, who are you going to blame and why? Why are you going to blame somebody for a complete accident of fate or nature? And, working as a kid, baling hay, shoveling horse shit, all the basic stuff like that kind of made it obvious to me that earning a salary of $6 an hour under the table, there's no one to blame. And if I were to blame someone, I would have been a complete loser. I would have been a complete failure in life. So ownership was something from the ground up I just took and owned, and it served me well in the military and beyond. So probably childhood.
You wrote about learned helplessness. Can you talk to us about learned helplessness through your perspective? How do we counteract that, and develop the, like we just talked about, the ownership, the victor, mindset instead?
Yeah, learned helplessness is a concept where a human is accustomed to a sense of helplessness, even if they're able to help themselves. So it's basically making a person into a form of a slave. A lot of that in the piece you're talking about, I made that. That's typically something you don't see in the pre-state world. It's impossible. If you're helpless, you're going to die the next day. That's a really common trait in the state. When I say state, I mean government, but particularly more so in like the authoritarian governments, communism, fascism, Nazism. Their whole goal is to make you helpless, completely dependent upon the government. And it happens in all states. It happens a lot in America. And that's just a natural consequence of having your day-to-day existence taken out of your hands and having to submit yourself to an entire system that obviously needs a certain amount of, you need to voluntarily submit to it. The way to beat that, I think, is to, what's the inverse of learned helplessness? Well, it's probably learned command, learning how to take command for yourself, make your own decisions, not have to rely on the government to make your decisions, even if you have to abide by certain laws and customs. Without a doubt, there's going to be a sense of command if you know why that's the situation, why you're adhering to it, when to disagree with it, and how far to go with that disagreement. I think the learned command, it makes, going back to our conversation about like what we can control and what we can't, the learned command takes away all that stuff outside of our control. The government, whatever the government does, if there happens to be even a flash flood, for instance, or a mudslide, or there's a famine, or there's a COVID lockdown, command takes it all back inside. Things all right back inside the mind. Am I going to become a victim of this situation? Am I going to let this thing happen to me? Or am I going to force myself on it? Am I going to happen to the situation? It's a complete pivot of the mind. It's breaking that model of learned helplessness, which is like a plague at present, I would argue, and bringing it back to a very ancient mind of, let's go back to Socrates. Mm-hmm. Socrates, before he was executed and on trial, said, "You can kill me, but you cannot harm me." That's the perfect example of command. You might literally be able to take my life, but you will never make me submit. That is, I think, the quintessential difference between helplessness and command.
So if you could teach one lesson from your experiences to the listeners on the show, what would it be?
I think it would come back to the gratitude. Just knowing that the peace and the ease that we just, tried to tear to shreds is actually a wonderful thing if it's kept in perspective. And through all the hardship, it's not just to like revel in how horrible everything it could be. It's to reframe and be grateful for how great we have it. So I'm not diatribing against the modern world or the first world or democracy or, again, a thermostat. These are all awesome things, only when they're kept in perspective. Otherwise, that's when I think learned helplessness kicks in, and then we begin to just drift. And then that's when the anxiety sets in and the depression and the feeling of uselessness and meaninglessness. And I think that by keeping the worst case scenario in mind, by practicing the worst case scenario, that's when we can take all these awesome things and really be grateful for it.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being on the show. I love talking with you. I really love your Substack. I love the essays that you write. I am going to be linking your Substack to this podcast so everybody can just go and subscribe and take a look. It's a free publication with your essays and stuff. And I highly recommend everyone to give them a read. It's a great perspective. And again, thanks for being on the show. You were absolutely fantastic.
Rock and roll. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And everyone that's listening, like, share, comment, subscribe, and become a Substack member to the podcast Substack. You know, it's completely free as well. And it's all to help you develop resilience, grit, and mental fitness. Thanks, guys. And see you all next Wednesday.